перераспределить некоторые ресурсы, чтобы обеспечить продолжение военных действий Украины. Комментарий, как говорится, излишний. Что ж, такая сегодня у Евросоюза дипломатия. Если доверить ей хоть какой-то аспект украинского регулирования, то от Украины точно ничего не останется. В-третьих, для установления долгосрочного мира на Украине должны быть устранены первопричины украинского конфликта. Целью Минска было дать такую автономию востоку страны и такие гарантии русскоязычному населению Украины, чтобы Донбасс вернулся в состав Украины. Это касалось и образования на русском языке, и возможности исповедовать каноническое православие, и права чтить тех героев, которые освобождали Украину от нацизма, а не тех преступников, кто вместе с гитлеровцами уничтожали сотни тысяч евреев, поляков, русских, цыган и тех же украинских. Те, кому сегодня поклоняются на Украине, во главе со Степаном Бандерой, о котором сегодня упоминал Reuters. Все это остается актуальным, с той лишь разницей, что Украина теперь безвозвратно потеряла не только Крым, но и Донецкую и Луганскую народные республики, и Херсонскую и Запорожскую области, вошедшие в состав России. Соответственно, исправлять ситуацию нужно в тех регионах, которые пока еще остаются под контролем Киева. Наконец, необходимо, чтобы реализацией новых договоренностей занималась та власть, которая будет искренне в этом заинтересована и которая появится по итогам демократических выборов. Выдающий себя за украинского президента Зеленский свою легитимность утратил в мае прошлого года. Кроме того, он, будучи избранным 3/4 украинцев за обещание добиться мира на Востоке, сделал все ровно наоборот и втянул страну в конфликт за чужие геополитические интересы, жертвами которого стали сотни тысяч украинцев. Ясно, что никакой роли ни он, ни его сподвижники, ни те, кто выступал против Минских соглашений, в новой Украине играть не должны. Это, собственно, понятно и из опросов общественного мнения в этой стране, которые четко указывают на то, что шайка Зеленского растеряла даже символическую поддержку своих граждан. Именно поэтому профессиональный украинский комик и бывший президент боится выборов как огня и всячески пытается оттянуть этот момент. Ну и последнее. Будущее Украины должна быть демилитаризованным нейтральным государством, не входящим ни в какие блоки и альянсы. Ведь, как сегодня уже признают наши американские коллеги, в частности президент Трамп, именно перспектива вступления Украины в НАТО стала спусковым крючком кризиса. Это, я думаю, понятно всем. Есть еще и другие важные элементы будущих договоренностей, которые Украины напрямую не касаются. Их мы сегодня здесь затрагивать не будем. Господин председатель, очень хочется надеяться, что 10-я годовщина принятия резолюции 2202 станет хорошим поводом для наших европейских коллег вернуться, наконец, к реальности и прекратить провоцировать Зеленского и его подельников на бессмысленное сопротивление. Сам он, стремясь любой ценой сохранить власть и собственную шкуру, готов на любые провокации, лишь бы продолжались военные действия и гибли его соотечественники. Об этом свидетельствуют такие новые, недавние топорные провокации киевского режима, как удар БПЛА по саркофагу Чернобыльской атомной электростанции и обстрел направлявшихся на ротацию на Запорожскую атомную электростанцию инспекторов МГТ. Если вы, наконец, не одернете своего ставленника в Киеве и не поставите его на место, ничем хорошим для Украины это не закончится. И те параметры урегулирования, которые мы обсуждаем сейчас, через некоторое время покажутся украинским властям несбыточной мечтой. Такой же, как сегодня являются для киевского режима сорванные им самим Минские договоренности. Благодарю вас.
我感谢俄罗斯代表的发言。下面请巴基斯坦代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I would begin by expressing gratitude to Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Yenka for his briefing, and also thank Mr. Roger Waters for his remarks. In a week from now, we would mark the 3rd year since the start of conflict in Ukraine. This conflict has continued to have long-term and wide-ranging consequences, not only for the region, but also for the international peace and security landscape. The disproportionate toll of this conflict on the lives of civilians, material damage, and loss of civilian infrastructure is particularly disturbing and deplorable. Mr. President, in 2015, a package of measures for the implementation of Minsk agreements was signed by the relevant stakeholders, aimed at bringing an end to the hostilities in the conflict areas and preserve peace. It was in this very chamber that the members of the Security Council unanimously adopted UN Security Council Resolution 2022, endorsing the measures of the Minsk Agreement, welcoming the declarations made by the leaders of Russian Federation, Ukraine, France, and Germany in support of the agreement, and called upon all parties to fully implement the provisions of the agreement. In this context, it is regrettable that the Minsk Agreement could not achieve the purpose of ensuring sustainable and lasting peace in the region. Mr. President, Pakistan is a staunch advocate of dialogue, use of peaceful means, and exercise of diplomacy for resolving disputes. On the Ukraine conflict, we have been consistent in our calls for restraint, eschewing the objective of settling the issue on the battlefield, respect for the UN Charter and its principles, and adoption of a path that leads to a negotiated settlement of the Ukraine conflict. Mr. President, we are encouraged to note that the calls for restraint and negotiated settlement of Ukraine conflict are now resonating widely, with more countries, besides the global South, expounding willingness to put their weight and political capital for the cause of peace and bringing an end to the hostilities which have led to a huge loss of life as well as infrastructure on both sides. We welcome this development, fully support it, and commend all diplomatic efforts aimed at bringing a sustainable and lasting peace to Ukraine and the region. I thank you very much.
我感谢巴基斯坦代表的发言，我请巴拿马代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Agradecemos al subsecretario general Yenka por su exposición informativa y al señor Reuters por las opiniones compartidas. Panamá reconoce que los acuerdos de Minsk representaron un esfuerzo diplomático que sentaba las bases de un alto al fuego inmediato en Ucrania antes del 2022 y que hace 10 años fue reconocido unánimemente por el Consejo de Seguridad por medio de la Resolución 2202 del 2015. Esta resolución respaldaba la aplicación de ese conjunto de medidas con el propósito de ofrecer una oportunidad a la solución pacífica de la crisis en el este de Ucrania entre el gobierno ucraniano y las fuerzas separatistas prorrusas. Los acuerdos permitían abrir un camino de paz que incluía la retirada de armamento pesado, acceso a la ayuda humanitaria y la liberación de prisioneros de guerra. Sin embargo, el 24 de febrero de 2022, la acción rusa contra la soberanía de Ucrania supuso el quebrantamiento de los principios fundacionales de esta organización y terminó de erosionar lo establecido en los acuerdos de Minsk. Después de 1090 días de esta invasión, seguimos inmersos en este conflicto que continúa ocasionando un daño humanitario irreparable para la nación ucraniana. Hemos sido informados periódicamente sobre las cifras estremecedoras de muertos y heridos, tanto civiles como militares, ataques a infraestructura crítica, el desplazamiento de millones de personas que abandonaron su hogar para buscar seguridad, así como las nefastas repercusiones físicas y mentales para niños y niñas que sufren el impacto de esta confrontación armada. En este sentido, Panamá reitera el llamamiento urgente a todas las partes para que, en virtud del derecho internacional humanitario, aseguren y protejan en todo momento a la población civil, al personal humanitario de las Naciones Unidas, así como a las instalaciones que brindan asistencia esencial a la población. De igual manera, exigimos la liberación de los prisioneros de guerra ucranianos, el retorno de los niños y civiles secuestrados que han vivido y presenciado todas las formas de violencia. Señor presidente, tomando en consideración los avances recientes para la solución de este conflicto, es imperativo aprender del pasado para evitar cometer los mismos errores. La Carta de las Naciones Unidas, que está próxima a conmemorar los 80 años de su vigencia y cuyo espíritu guía a los Estados miembros de esta organización, debe ser siempre la piedra angular para asegurar el diálogo, la confianza y la solución pacífica de los conflictos, con el fin de mantener la paz y la seguridad internacionales en fiel cumplimiento del derecho internacional. En esa misma línea, Panamá reitera su apoyo a la soberanía, integridad territorial y la independencia política de Ucrania. De igual manera, le damos la bienvenida a todos los esfuerzos y conversaciones que incluyan a Ucrania y que tengan como objetivo, al fin, agotar esfuerzos diplomáticos respaldados por voluntad política suficiente que esta vez logren el cese al fuego inmediato, la liberación de todos los prisioneros de guerra y por esa vía alcanzar una comprensiva paz que pueda ser duradera. Los acuerdos de Minsk fueron una muestra de que es posible hacer rutas tangibles conducentes a la paz, siempre y cuando exista voluntad política. Sin embargo, cuando se fractura, cuando se pierde esa voluntad, se pierde el compromiso, desmoronándose lo logrado. Hacemos un llamado a la reflexión para retomar el camino de la diplomacia y del diálogo como la única vía hacia una paz sostenible. Muchas gracias.
我感谢巴拿马代表的发言，下面我请韩国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I extend my gratitude to ASG Yencha for his briefing and take note of Mr. Waters' remarks. As we are approaching the third anniversary of the war in Ukraine, the international community is at a critical juncture. As a series of key discussions are taking place to end this conflict, we believe the attention on such discussions stems from the international community's shared aspiration to end the inhumane loss of lives and destructions which has lasted for nearly the last 1,100 days in Ukraine. Russia, instead of peacefully resolving the conflict, resorted to the use of force and invaded Ukraine in blatant violation of the UN Charter. This not only unleashed untold human suffering over the past 3 years, but also aggravated existing global challenges, including food and energy insecurity. Regardless of any argument, it remains clear that Russia invaded its neighboring country in clear violation of its sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. The entire world is well aware of who is aggressor and who is the victim. As affirmed in multiple UNGA resolutions supported by the overwhelming majority of member states. Mr. President, another significant repercussions this war has caused is North Korea's substantial military support to Russia, both in troops and munitions, which are again grave violations of international law and relevant Security Council resolutions. Russia's collusion with the DPRK, a state that pursues its WMD and ballistic missiles programs at the cost of non-proliferation and its people's well-being, exemplifies the illegal and irresponsible nature of this war. We urge Russia and DPRK to immediately cease the illegal and dangerous military cooperation, which has exacerbated the suffering of the Ukrainian people and actively undermine both the global non-proliferation regime and this Council's previous decisions. And we must not forget that the DPRK has sacrificed its own troops with more than 3,000 casualties among some 11,000 troops dispatched in an effort to leverage their losses for compensation from Russia. This support that is crucial for advancing Pyongyang's illegal WMD and ballistic missiles programs and sustaining the regime. Mr. President, 3 years into this brutal war, I express my sincere hope that this year, Ukrainians can return to the peaceful lives they lived before the war. As a once war-torn country, the Korean people know just how painful the path toward overcoming the devastating of war is. At the same time, we know that the history is on the side of freedom, justice, human rights, the rule of law, and the UN Charter. In this light, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its commitment to supporting Ukraine and its people until they overcome the current hardship. I thank you.
我感谢韩国代表的发言，下面我请索马里代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank ASD Yanka for his comprehensive briefing and express appreciation to Mr. Waters for sharing his valuable insights. The Minsk Agreement represented a significant diplomatic endeavor aimed at peaceful conflict resolution through dialogue and negotiation. The agreement signed in 2014 and 2015 ultimately failed to prevent what would become Europe's largest conflict since World War II. The experience gained from their implementation merits careful consideration by this Council, as it bears direct relevance to our collective responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. In that regard, I would like to make the following observations. First, the implementation of ceasefire provisions, while central to any peace process, requires robust and impartial verification mechanisms. The dedicated efforts of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission demonstrated both the value and the inherent limitation of existing verification framework within complex security environments. Therefore, it's critical to develop a more robust frameworks for monitoring and verifying compliance with peace agreements, drawing upon the expertise of the United Nations Secretariat and its specialized agencies. Second, the precise formulation of peace agreements require particular attention to implementation sequencing and the establishment of unambiguous benchmarks for compliance. The experience of the Minsk Agreement underscores the importance of clarity in diplomatic instruments, particularly regarding the synchronization of political and security measures. Third, in the years leading up to February 2022, despite clear warning signs, we did not take decisive preventative actions. It's incumbent upon this Council to examine its preventative role as mandated by the Charter and enhance its early warning capabilities through strengthened coordination with regional organizations and relevant United Nations entities. The credibility of the Council, and indeed the United Nations itself, rests not on our ability to respond to conflicts, but on our capacity to prevent them. Mr. President, the Security Council preventative and Pacific settlement of disputes mandates remain cornerstone of the international peace and security architecture. Its effective execution requires not only the necessary institutional frameworks, but also sustained commitment of all member states to the principle enshrined in the Charter. As we contemplate these matters, it's clear after 3 years of war in Ukraine that there can be no military solution to the conflict. It requires enhanced international cooperation and a renewed commitment to diplomacy in accordance with principles of the United Nations. It's imperative that all parties work toward de-escalation and the creation of an environment conducive to constructive dialogue and peaceful resolution of the conflict. My delegation stands ready to engage constructively with Council members and the broader United Nations membership in strengthening our collective capacity for conflict prevention and resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢索马里代表的发言，下面我请美国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Assistant Secretary General Janka, for your remarks. Colleagues, the goal of the Minsk agreements was an end to the fighting and restoration of Ukraine's control over its territory within its internationally recognized borders. Russia signed these agreements but never implemented any of the commitments it agreed to, not a single one. Not the Minsk Protocol or the Minsk package of measures, not the scores of interventions negotiated by the Trilateral Contact Group. These commitments included agreements on ceasefire, the withdrawal of foreign military forces from Ukraine's sovereign territory, the disbanding of illegal armed groups in eastern Ukraine that received support from Russia, and the return of control of the Ukrainian side of the international border to Ukraine. Russia did none of these things. Instead, Russia consistently and repeatedly worked to undermine the fundamental purpose of the Minsk agreements, escalated the fighting, and undermined international monitoring efforts. As our Secretary of Defense stated last week at the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, we want a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. Russia's bluster about the Minsk agreements is a distraction from fundamental, undeniable facts. Ukraine is a sovereign, independent country, and Russia's illegal war of conquest violates the UN Charter. Russia must immediately end its war against Ukraine, which not only violates international law, but was also a strategic error for Russia. The easy way out is through negotiations, now. If Russia instead chooses the hard way, it will incur greater and escalating costs to its economy and losses on the battlefield. The United States, as President Trump has made clear, is committed to ending the carnage and restoring stability to Europe. Ukraine, Russia, and our European partners need to be a part of the conversation. We also call on other UN member states to join us in seeking an end to this conflict. And with that, I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢美国代表的发言，下面我请圭亚那代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Yencha for his briefing and took careful note of Mr. Waters' contribution to our discussion today. Last week marked 10 years since the adoption of Resolution 2202, which endorsed the package of measures to the implementation of the Minsk agreements and reaffirmed that the resolution of the situation in the eastern regions of Ukraine could only be achieved through peaceful means. Yet, in just 1 week from today, we will be marking another anniversary, 3 years of the brutal war in Ukraine. Although some may lament the failure of the Minsk agreements and suggest that the ensuing conflict could only be settled on the battlefield, Guyana insists on drawing the right lessons from the past. There are no shortcuts. Enduring peace demands a firm commitment to addressing and resolving the root causes of the conflict. It means ensuring justice and promoting reconciliation. It also means having a common understanding of the provisions of the agreement and the expectations of all sides. It requires political will. Guyana maintains its steadfast support for a peaceful resolution to the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We also join the international community in reaffirming the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and in calling for full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The failed implementation of the Minsk Accords cannot be the reason to prolong this war. Guyana reiterates its call for an immediate end to the hostilities and the withdrawal of Russian military forces from the territory of Ukraine. We urge the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict. We take note of the ongoing efforts to achieve sustainable peace and welcome the continued engagement of the international community to this end. I thank you.
我感谢圭亚那代表的发言，下面我请阿尔及利亚代表发言。
شكرا السيد الرئيس. أشكر الأمين العام المساعد السيد ميروسلاف يانكا على إحاطته. كما استمعت بكل عناية لمداخلة السيد روجي ووترز. تمر اليوم 10 سنوات منذ اعتماد مجلس الأمن بالإجماع قراره رقم 2202 الذي جاء ليؤيد مجموعة التدابير المتخذة لتنفيذ اتفاقات مينسك، محملا بالدعوة لجميع الأطراف إلى أن تنفذ مجموعة التدابير هذه بالكامل، بما في ذلك الوقف الشامل لإطلاق النار. حيث جاء هذا القرار آنذاك ليتوج العمل الدؤوب الذي كان قد أعطى الأولوية القصوى للدبلوماسية الوقائية. وكان من المفترض أن يصبح هذا الحدث بمثابة مثالا يحتذى به لتبيان فوائد الحوار البناء وفضائل المفاوضات في إنهاء القتال والعنف، لكن وللأسف لم تأخذ الأحداث هذا المجرى المنشود، ولم يسجل التاريخ هذه القصة الناجحة، بل وعلى عكس ذلك نجتمع اليوم والوضع في المنطقة قد زاد تعقيدا أكثر مما كان عليه، حيث اتسعت رقعة المواجهات وزادت حدتها، ولا نزال نسجل يوما بعد يوم مزيدا من الخسائر في الأرواح البشرية البريئة من المدنيين الذين لم يسلم منهم النساء ولا حتى الأطفال. ويتواصل الوضع الأمني والإنساني في التدهور، حيث نحصي الملايين من المهجرين، بالإضافة إلى دمار كبير في البنى التحتية المدنية من مساكن ومستشفيات ومدارس وجامعات ومنشآت طاقوية وحيوية. والأمر من هذا كله أن الأمل الذي صاحب اتفاقات مينسك ظل مفقودا خلال السنوات الماضية التي لم تشهد أي حوار بناء وشامل بين الطرفين. وعليه ترى الجزائر أنه من الأهمية بمكان الوقوف اليوم عند هذه المحطة واستخلاص بعض الدروس منها، ونود في هذا الصدد التركيز على النقاط التالية. أولا، قد تكون اتفاقات مينسك قد أخفقت في تجسيد مخرجاتها، لكنها بلا شك ستبقى شاهدا على إخفاق أكبر من ذلك، وهو إخفاق منطق القوة والمواجهة في توفير السلم والأمن في المنطقة، وهي نقطة لا تزال الجزائر تشير إليها. فنتائج عدم تطبيق هذه الاتفاقيات على الأرض أصبحت اليوم وللأسف مرئية وملموسة بالنظر إلى الوضع الحالي في المنطقة. ثانيا، إن هذه الاتفاقات تبقى مثالا لما قد يحققه الحوار الجاد والبناء والشامل من تقدم نحو استتباب السلم والأمن، كما تبقى أحسن شاهد على النتائج الكارثية التي قد تنجر عن الابتعاد عن طريق الدبلوماسية والحوار. ولنا كذلك في مبادرة البحر الأسود لنقل الحبوب، وفي مختلف اتفاقيات تبادل الأسرى بين الطرفين أمثلة أخرى لما يمكن تحقيقه من خلال الحوار والمفاوضات. ثالثاً، وبوصفنا أعضاء في مجلس الأمن، فإن مهمتنا الأولى وهدفنا الأسمى يجب أن يكون في العمل جاهدين على توفير السلم والأمن في المنطقة، وهو ما يمكن أن يتأتى في منظورنا من خلال تشجيع الطرفين على الانخراط في مسار تفاوضي حقيقي. ففشل تنفيذ اتفاقات مينسك لا يمنعنا من الاستلهام بروحه، هذه الروح نفسها التي غلبت توافق الآراء على المواجهة، والتي فضلت التفاهم المشترك على الاستقطاب. وهذا هو جوهر موقف الجزائر من هذا النزاع، وهو الموقف الذي عبرنا عنه مرارا وتكرارا في هذه القاعة، والذي يدعو إلى تكثيف الجهود الدبلوماسية من أجل تحقيق سلام عادل ودائم تبنى أسسه على مقاصد ومبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة، ويأخذ بعين الاعتبار الشواغل الأمنية المشروعة لجميع الأطراف. وشكرا.
我感谢阿尔及利亚代表的发言。我下面请塞拉利昂代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenka for his briefing. We also take note of the contribution of Mr. Roger Waters. Sierra Leone welcomes the participation of the representative of Ukraine in this meeting. In 7 days, we will mark the end of the third year of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, which has resulted in over 40,000 civilian casualties and widespread destruction of vital civilian infrastructure, including homes, schools, hospitals, markets, and energy facilities. A severe humanitarian crisis is unfolding in Ukraine, with limited access to food, income, and essential services. According to OCHA, there are approximately 3.6 million internally displaced persons within Ukraine, some displaced for over a year. Additionally, the conflict has prevented over 6.8 million refugees from returning to their homes, creating the largest displacement crisis in Europe since World War II, as reported by UNHCR. Deliberate targeting of critical energy infrastructure, including thermal, hydro, and nuclear power plants, in both Russia and Ukraine poses significant regional and global risks. The attack on the former Chernobyl nuclear plant in Ukraine last Friday, which damaged protective infrastructure meant to prevent radiation leaks, exemplifies the dangerous consequences of targeting energy facilities. The impact of this conflict has been particularly devastating for millions of children, many of whom have suffered physical injuries from bombings and live in constant fear. Their mental and emotional health has been deeply affected, compounded by poor sanitation, disease outbreaks, loss of loved ones, separation from families, and prolonged displacement. Sierra Leone reiterates that attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are strictly prohibited under international law. We call on all parties to comply fully with international law, especially international humanitarian law. Reflecting on the Minsk agreements endorsed by Security Council Resolution 2202 in 2015, we acknowledge the original hope that they would lead to a cessation of hostilities and facilitate political dialogue. Unfortunately, that outcome was not realized. Regardless of the reasons for this failure, the priority now must be to find a pathway to an immediate ceasefire and lasting peace that will end the suffering of men, women, and children on both sides. Mr. President, the conflict in Ukraine will not be resolved by military means. It is essential that a political settlement based on full adherence to the principles of the UN Charter ensures respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. At the same time, the legitimate concerns of all parties must be addressed. A solution to this protracted conflict must consider its protracted and entrenched nature, addressing the drivers of the conflict since 2014. Over this period, which 15,961 civilians have been killed in Ukraine, with significant casualties also in Russia. Diplomatic negotiations in 2014, culminating in the signing of the second Minsk agreement, demonstrate that peace is achievable through the willingness and good faith participation of both parties, with support from influential third parties. We acknowledge the concerted efforts made by various countries over the years to facilitate ceasefires through the Minsk agreements, bilateral talks, multilateral actions, and the UN General Assembly resolutions. President, there are indications that diplomatic avenues remain open. The Security Council must therefore work together to articulate a coherent, holistic process with clear objectives and political elements. We must speak with one voice in support of an immediate ceasefire and lasting peace. While the Minsk agreement sought to resolve the conflict on a smaller scale, their successes and shortcomings provide valuable lessons. First, the peace process must be guided by a clear articulation of the end goals, with a shared understanding of the steps that must be taken by the parties, intermediaries, and other stakeholders. The process must also be underpinned by a robust management framework and compliance mechanisms that have proven effective in ensuring states adhere to agreements. Second, considering the significant differences in peace proposals from Russia and Ukraine, careful consideration should be given to their alignment with the principles of the UN Charter, international law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The long-term implications for regional and global stability must also be addressed, as peace agreements must reflect the realities of people's lives and the global context. Third, the legitimacy of the peace process and its outcomes must be affirmed at the national, regional, and international levels. It is critical that all relevant stakeholders, including political actors, women, youth, and civil society, are consulted and actively participate. Furthermore, the necessary legislative and constitutional processes must be followed. At the international level, the Security Council has demonstrated its commitment to supporting lasting peace and should continue to do so. Regional arrangements can also play a complementary role and are to be engaged as well. In conclusion, Mr. President, we're fully aware that this process demands patience and persistence. We urge the parties to refrain from escalating the conflict further and to commit to diplomatic engagement that will lead to the cessation of hostilities and the peaceful resolution of this conflict. I thank you.
我感谢塞拉利昂代表的发言，下面我请丹麦代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I extend my appreciation to Assistant Secretary General Genscher for his briefing. I also welcome the participation of Ukraine in today's meeting. Denmark relishes any opportunity to address the unjust war in Ukraine and the suffering of the Ukrainian people. However, today's meeting is just another attempt to deflect reality and justify Russia's illegal and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. This war remains a blatant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. Denmark, along with other members of this Council, supported the Minsk process and Normandy format. These negotiations were launched in good faith to maintain peace while preserving Ukraine's territorial integrity. We all know who blatantly ignored the commitments under these agreements and effectively killed the Minsk process. President Putin himself proudly declaring that the Minsk agreements no longer existed. Mr. President, this meeting is part of an ongoing disinformation campaign to try and detract us from the real objective, the subjugation of Ukraine and the denial of its sovereignty and independence. Denmark stands by Ukraine. We are committed to its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity in the face of Russia's war of aggression. Tragically, this illegal war of aggression has raged now for almost 3 years, resulting in terrible human suffering and serious global consequences. Deliberate attacks against civilian targets, including hospitals, schools, residential areas, and critical infrastructure, have continued unabated. Indeed, these attacks are escalating. OCHA has briefed this Council on the dramatic 31% increase in civilian deaths in 2024 compared to 2023. Lately, we received the chilling news that the radiation shelter of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was hit by a drone. It is another stark reminder of the reckless and very dangerous actions. Human rights abuses, both in temporarily occupied Ukrainian territory and in Russia itself have also persisted. These include the widespread and systematic torture of prisoners of war and other civilian detainees, as well as the abduction and deportation of Ukrainian children, which constitutes a war crime. Denmark condemns these crimes in the strongest possible terms. Mr. President, there must be accountability for Russia's crimes in Ukraine if there is to be a just and lasting peace, accountability for the crimes committed and for this crime of aggression. Justice must prevail. Therefore, we welcome the ongoing work of the ICC and commend Ukraine for its ratification of the Rome Statute. We further welcome the important work towards establishing a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, hosted by the Council of Europe, but open to support from all countries. To conclude, let us all be clear. There is only one aggressor in this illegal war. We support Ukraine in achieving a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace. Peace in Ukraine cannot be separated from Europe's security. There can be no lasting peace without Ukraine and without Europe. This war could stop immediately if Russia stopped attacking Ukraine and withdrew its forces. We call on Russia to do just that, to bring this senseless war to an end once and for all. Thank you.
我感谢丹麦代表的发言。我下面请斯洛文尼亚代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary General Jenča for his briefing. I also take note of the statement of Mr. Waters, and I welcome representative of Ukraine in the chamber. Mr. President, the Minsk agreements were supposed to bring peace in East Ukraine and reintegrate separatist-controlled areas with the rest of the country. Slovenia has therefore always supported them, and we have consistently encouraged both sides to fully implement the agreements. After almost 3 years of intense fighting, it is imperative to repeat that peace in Ukraine is long overdue. The Minsk agreements carry an important lesson for us all in this respect. And with this in mind, I would like to submit the following. 1. Specificity. We need something more than Minsk III. The abstract nature of the Minsk agreements enabled arbitrary interpretations, which provided an alibi for their violations. Any future ceasefire or peace agreement must be much more specific. It will need clear timelines, defined sequencing, and strong monitoring mechanisms. 2. Trust. This will be the key issue of negotiating any future peace agreement and, above all, of its implementation. With its invasion, Russia violated the international law, the UN Charter, the Budapest Memorandum, as well as the Helsinki Final Act on inviolability of borders in Europe. For Ukraine and Russia to reach a deal, rebuilding trust will be a tremendous task. Russia will need to demonstrate to Ukraine, to the rest of the European continent, and the entire world that it can be trusted to hold up to its commitments. Mr. President, the Russian invasion put an end to our hope that Minsk agreements can bring peace, stability, and reintegration to eastern Ukraine. However, on the lookout for lasting peace in Ukraine, it is counterproductive to linger over past agreements, especially the ones that met an early end because of one's own actions or inactions. We need to learn from past failures, not to dwell on them. This is the first step on the way to building trust and securing future stability in Eastern Europe. Thank you.
我感谢斯洛文尼亚代表的发言。我下面请希腊代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank AHG Miroslav Jenča for his briefing, and I also took note of the remarks of Roger Waters. Mr. President, Greece supported from the very beginning the efforts undertaken to establish and strengthen the ceasefire in Ukraine through the Minsk agreements. We consider the application, mediated by the normative format, as the only path to de-escalate tensions and settle the conflict in eastern Ukraine. We actively participate in the Special Observer Mission in Ukraine,
with experienced observers and contributed at the budget of the mission. However, a relatively brief period of optimism concerning the peace agreement was, despite concerted efforts by France and Germany, followed by actions such as the recognition by Russia of the independence of the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the illegal annexation of Ukrainian territories. By doing so, Russia violated the UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, and the Budapest Memorandum. Mr. President, let us be clear. No interpretation of the Minsk agreements can ever justify the invasion of Ukraine, which constitutes a clear, blatant violation of the UN Charter. In the threshold of the fourth year of war, Russia has not heeded the calls of the international community enshrined in multiple General Assembly resolutions with overwhelming majorities to withdraw its forces from the internationally recognized territories of Ukraine and respect its sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. On the contrary, it has intensified its attack on civilian targets and energy assets with heavy weaponry, combat drones, and ballistic missiles across Ukraine, with complete disregard for the life of civilians. We reaffirm a strong condemnation of any such attacks. January saw an increase of almost 40% in civilian casualties compared to the previous month, 22 of whom were children. We are deeply concerned about the repercussion of this war on children, whose lives has been either ended or disrupted, often beyond repair, and we call for accountability for all violations against them. We also deplore the attacks on Ukraine cultural landmarks, as with the missile attack in Odessa on the last days of January, causing damage to more than 15 UNESCO-protected buildings in the center of a city that holds great historical significance for my country. Mr. President, in a few days on February 24th, the General Assembly will once more declare its stance on a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine by taking action on a new draft resolution. Greece fully supports this initiative in the hope that the collective voice of the General Assembly will finally be heeded and respected. Mr. President, before closing, let me reiterate our full support to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and our support to the efforts towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, while stressing that there can be no solution with Ukraine and without Europe at the table. I thank you.
感谢希腊代表的发言。下面我请法国代表发言。
Monsieur le Président, il importe de s'en tenir aux faits. En Ukraine, il y a un agresseur, la Russie, qui viole le droit international et a attaqué un État souverain qui ne le menaçait en rien. Et il y a un agressé, l'Ukraine, qui, en vertu de la Charte des Nations Unies, dispose du droit de défendre son indépendance et son intégrité territoriale. C'est ce même agresseur, la Russie, qui, quelques jours avant de lancer son invasion à grande échelle de l'Ukraine, a choisi de mettre fin, de façon unilatérale et par la force, aux accords de Minsk. Ceux-ci avaient pour principal objectif la réintégration sous souveraineté ukrainienne de certaines régions de Donetsk et de Luhansk, selon un modèle d'autonomie spécifique. En tant que médiatrice, la France et l'Allemagne ont tenté sans relâche de permettre à la Russie et à l'Ukraine de trouver un terrain d'entente pour que les accords soient appliqués et permettre une résolution pacifique du conflit dans le Donbass. Mais la Russie a fait le choix de l'escalade, puis celui de la guerre. Malgré son engagement de façade à respecter les accords de Minsk, elle n'a cessé d'attiser les tensions dans le Donbass et s'est employée à déstabiliser l'Ukraine. S'opposant en médiateur neutre et niant son implication militaire, elle était en réalité dès 2014 une partie au conflit dans le Donbass, fournissant des armes et du renseignement aux séparatistes et se retirant du mécanisme de vérification du cessez-le-feu en 2016, la Russie a œuvré à la mise en échec des accords de Minsk. Ces tentatives de faire porter à l'Ukraine ou à la France et l'Allemagne la responsabilité de cet échec ne trompent personne. Dès le mois d'avril 2021, elle a massé ses troupes et ses matériels à la frontière ukrainienne. Puis, le 21 février 2022, elle a reconnu unilatéralement l'indépendance des républiques autoproclamées de Donetsk et de Luhansk. Le 24 février, elle a lancé son invasion à grande échelle contre l'Ukraine, violant la Charte des Nations Unies et le droit international. Je rappelle que la Russie avait passé près de 8 ans à répéter son soutien aux accords de Minsk, dont elle était signataire, et qui était endossé par la résolution 2202 de ce Conseil. En lançant sa guerre d'agression contre l'Ukraine, la Russie a pris seule la décision de faire voler en éclats les accords de Minsk. Elle a choisi de mettre fin au dialogue et à la négociation. Elle a choisi la guerre. Ceux qui s'interrogent sur l'échec des accords de Minsk peuvent commencer par se tourner vers la Russie. Monsieur le Président, la Russie doit respecter l'ordonnance de la Cour internationale de justice qui lui a demandé, dès le 16 mars 2022, de suspendre immédiatement ses opérations militaires. Elle ne peut non plus continuer d'ignorer les résolutions de l'Assemblée générale qui ont condamné cette agression à 7 reprises et appelé au respect de l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine. Dans une semaine, nous serons de nouveau réunis pour marquer les 3 ans du début de l'invasion à grande échelle de l'Ukraine par la Russie. L'Ukraine présentera à l'Assemblée générale une résolution qui trace le chemin vers une paix juste, globale et durable, conforme à la Charte des Nations unies. Elle a tout notre soutien. L'Ukraine est un souverain et l'Europe, dont la sécurité est en jeu, doivent participer à toute négociation et être en mesure de décider de leur destin. Un règlement du conflit qui serait décidé sans eux ne saurait être durable. Il consacrerait la supériorité de la force sur le droit et la revendication de sphères d'influence au mépris de l'égalité souveraine des États. La France est prête à renforcer son soutien à l'Ukraine. Nous le maintiendrons aussi longtemps que nécessaire. En ce moment même, des consultations entre dirigeants européens se tiennent à Paris, à l'initiative du président de la République, Emmanuel Macron, sur la situation en Ukraine et les enjeux de sécurité en Europe. Ces travaux pourront se prolonger dans d'autres formats, dans l'objectif de rassembler l'ensemble des partenaires intéressés à la paix et la sécurité en Europe. Je vous remercie.
我感谢法国代表的发言，下面我请英国代表发言。
Thank you, President, and I thank Assistant Secretary Yenka for his briefing. President, Russia is once again using this meeting in an attempt to distort the truth behind its illegal war. I'll make 3 points about lessons. First, the events of the last decade in Ukraine originate from a simple, sad reality. Russia's imperialist ambition and failure to respect Ukraine's sovereignty. Russia is not a reliable party to agreements or treaties. In freely signing up to the Minsk agreements, Russia had the opportunity to ensure peace. Russia and Ukraine were the sole parties to those agreements. And this Council consistently called on all parties to implement their commitments in full, right up until the moment when President Putin decided that on the 22nd of February 2022, I quote, the Minsk agreement no longer existed. Second, Russia continues to violate the UN Charter and international law in multiple ways. In its war in Ukraine, Russia has targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, energy infrastructure. It has abducted children. It has raped women. It has compromised nuclear safety and security, flouted international law, and tortured detainees. For all these reasons, it is no surprise that the ICJ has issued an indictment on President Putin. We will not tolerate Russia's attempts to spread disinformation and divert this Council's attention away from its atrocities or its efforts to subjugate a sovereign state. Russia is the sole architect of the war in Ukraine and could end it now, if it chose to, by withdrawing its forces. Third lesson is that the international community must stand firm in support of peace and security. No one wants this war to end more than Ukraine. But Putin's so-called preconditions for talks reaffirmed by his Deputy Foreign Minister just a few days ago, have been that Ukraine withdraw from its own sovereign territory and abandon its sovereign right to choose its alliances. No country could or should accept this. So we can and must create the conditions for a just and lasting peace, which protects Ukraine's security, sovereignty, and independence. This will require robust security arrangements from the outset, which ensure that Russia is never able to invade again. Putin has shown time and again that he will break a weak deal. The UK will continue to play our part. We will continue to provide concrete support for Ukraine's self-defense and security for as long as it is needed. And we are clear that Ukraine's voice must be at the heart of any negotiations. Let me conclude, President, by reminding Russia that the suffering of so many Ukrainians today simply would not exist if Russia fulfilled its most basic obligation as a member of the United Nations, to respect the principles of the UN Charter. I thank you.
我感谢英国代表的发言。我现在以中国代表的身份发言。我首先感谢严洽助理秘书长和 Reuters 先生所做的通报。10年前，乌克兰问题当事方通过谈判达成了新明斯克协议，安理会一致通过第2202号决议予以核可，代表了通过对话谈判解决分歧和争端的正确方向。遗憾的是，协议达成后，大部分条款未能得到全面有效执行。本该逐步降温的局势，反而愈演愈烈，进而导致危机全面升级，酿成更大规模的冲突，持续延宕至今。新明斯克协议的失败令人痛惜，其历史教训值得反思。各位同事，对于世界上的争端和冲突，中国一贯主张根据宪章规定，通过对话协商，以和平方式解决。在俄乌冲突问题上也一样。中国不是这场危机的制造者，更不是当事方，但我们没有隔岸观火，更没有借机谋利。从危机爆发之初，中方就呼吁对话协商解决问题。习近平主席提出4点主张，强调各国主权和领土完整应得到尊重，联合国宪章宗旨和原则应得到遵守，各方合理安全关切应得到重视，一切致力于和平的努力应得到支持。这是中方在乌克兰问题上的根本遵循。中方积极开展外交斡旋，同包括俄罗斯、乌克兰在内的有关各方保持接触。中方深入参与联合国和安理会框架下关于乌克兰问题的审议，为推动停火止战、政治解决发挥建设性作用。中方还同巴西等国发起和平之友小组，汇聚全球南方国家集体智慧，形成支持和推动和平的重要力量。形势发展证明，中方的主张客观、公正、理性、务实，与国际社会的广泛共识是高度一致的。当前，乌克兰问题即将迎来谈判解决的关键时刻，任何冲突的终点 都是谈判桌，历史最终一定是公正的。我们乐见一切致力于和平的努力，包括美俄达成的关于启动和谈的共识。同时，我们也期待所有当事方和利益攸关方都能参与到和谈进程中来，达成公平、持久、有约束力、所有当事方都接受的和平协议。战事发生在欧洲大地，欧洲有必要为和平发挥作用。我们希望各方通过谈判共同解决危机的根源性问题，找到均衡、有效、可持续的安全架构，实现欧洲大陆的长治久安。我现在继续行使安理会主席的职责。俄罗斯代表要求再次发言，我现在请他发言。
Господин председатель, спасибо. Очень показательное сегодня заседание. Я хочу поблагодарить наших европейских коллег и их союзников за то, что сегодня своими выступлениями они лишний раз красочно продемонстрировали полную оторванность европейской дипломатии от реальности и ее неспособности к какому-либо анализу. Эта дипломатия, живет в прошлом и останется там. Ее задача сегодня продлить как можно дольше агонию киевского режима в надежде, что этот режим сможет ослабить Россию. Продолжайте, коллеги, пребывать в этой несбыточной иллюзии, а мы пойдем дальше и так или иначе решим этот кризис. Наша британская коллега сегодня нам преподавала уроки. Я бы посоветовал ей лучше учить материальную часть, прежде чем приходить на эти заседания. Минские соглашения были заключены не между Украиной и Россией, а между Украиной и Донецкой Народной Республикой и Луганской Народной Республикой. Почитайте документ, посмотрите на текст, он доступен. Сейчас все пытается переваливать с больной головы на здоровую, обвиняя Россию в том, что это, оказывается, она не выполнила Минские соглашения. Минские соглашения, которые мы добросовестно пытались заставить Украину выполнить, но которая их постоянно саботировала при поддержке своих западных спонсоров. А то, что на нас накладывают вину за то, что мы объявили окончание Минских соглашений, так мы всего лишь констатировали медицинский факт, потому что к тому моменту Минские соглашения, которые вы все здесь саботировали, вы западные страны, вы гаранты Минских соглашений, они умерли. Благодаря вам. Спасибо.
哦，下面我请乌克兰代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. And I thank AHG Mr. Miroslav Jenča for his briefing. Today's meeting serves as a reminder of how the Russian Federation treats those agreements to which it is a party. And the Minsk agreements are a powerful example and one of many. On this very day in 2022, in this very chamber, the delegation of Ukraine, along with many Security Council members, expressed concern over dangerous developments triggered by the Russian Federation. These include the buildup of troops along the border with Ukraine and the line of contact in Donbas, as well as parliamentary appeal urging Putin to recognize the temporarily occupied parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine as so-called People's Republics. Both actions run counter to the Russian Federation's obligations under the Minsk agreements and were aimed at laying the groundwork for escalating its aggression against Ukraine to the level of a full-scale war. Let me remind that at that meeting, Russia assured the Security Council that, I quote, "there is no alternative to that momentous document," notably the Minsk agreements. Almost immediately, the Russian Federation killed the Minsk agreements brutally and deliberately. 4 days later, on February 21, 2022, the Russian Federation recognized the so-called independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine. A week later, on February 24, 2022, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine. Distinguished colleagues, let me reiterate that although not adopted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, Resolution 2202/2015 was a very important message from the Council to all parties, including to the Russian Federation, to implement the Minsk agreements. Let me also recall that the entire history of the Minsk agreements since the first documents were signed in September 2014 was a long list of violations and disregard by Moscow of its own commitments. As happened with paragraph 4 of the Minsk Protocol of 5 September 2014, envisaging, I quote, establishment of a security area in the border regions of Ukraine and the Russian Federation, end of quote. It is interesting how such a clear commitment could align with Russia's claims that it was not a party to the agreements. Needless to say, it was never implemented by Russia. Paragraph 9 of the Minsk Memorandum, signed by Russia on 19 September 2014, stated that, I quote, all foreign military formations and military equipment, as well as militants and mercenaries, are to exit the territory of Ukraine under OSCE monitoring, end of quote, also never implemented by Russia. Finally, a week after the third Minsk document, a package of measures, was signed on 12 February 2015, the Ukrainian city of Debaltseve sustained a full-fledged offensive and was occupied by regular Russian troops and their proxies. These are just a few examples of how the Russian Federation violated the agreements almost immediately after signing them, and all these violations finally paved the way to the Kremlin's decision to invade my country. While Ukraine took unprecedented steps to find ways to achieve a peaceful settlement and put forward numerous proposals to this end, Russia spared no effort to obstruct the process under various pretexts, effectively stalling the work of the Trilateral Contact Group long before the full-scale invasion. Naturally, it always blamed Ukraine and manipulated quotes from foreign officials to justify its actions. Nothing has changed, as we could see from today's statement by the Russian Federation. To summarize all this propaganda in this statement, it will be no surprise when time comes that Russia, in an attempt to escape responsibility, refers to the entire special military operation as a Ukrainian propaganda provocation. While the Russian Federation continues to put the blame on others, just last week we witnessed how Moscow yet again put the world on the brink of the nuclear disaster by carrying out a drone strike on the new safe confinement structure over the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Here again, the criminal blamed the victim. Unfortunately, it was not the only propaganda we have heard today in this chamber. It is baffling that such a simple idea that people of Ukraine are pro-Ukrainian, and that is why we defend and will continue to defend our native soul and ourselves, does not occur to the singers of the Russian propaganda. It's baffling that these advocates of diplomacy and common sense fail to understand that to prevent wars, they should never have started by the aggressor, even if aggressor calls the real war a special operation. How dare one deprives an entire nation of its identity? It is a disgusting manifestation of colonialism at its core. It is because people of Ukraine are pro-Ukrainian, the Russian Federation has failed its war. It is important to remember, distinguished members of the Security Council, that Russia's approach to new arrangements will not change either. What responsible states see as commitments to be upheld, the Russian Federation treats as a tactical ploy. It will readily break any agreement the very moment its new aggressive plans require so. That is why any arrangement involving the Kremlin must include enforcement mechanism and preventive measures. Weak agreements will not bring real peace. They will only lead to the greater war. That is why we are working with our partners to find strong and effective solutions. Peace cannot be bought, especially not at the expense of law and principles, especially principle of territorial integrity and sovereign equality. Peace cannot be replaced with appeasement. History offers many relevant examples. Our task is to avoid repeating past mistakes, as the cost of those mistakes is more blood, suffering, and destruction. Thank you.
我感谢乌克兰代表的发言，下面我请德国代表发言。
Mr. President, thank you for this opportunity to address the Council today, and I would also like to thank ISG Jenscha for his briefing. Today's meeting references the joint diplomatic efforts of France and Germany to support the peace negotiations following Russia's initial aggression against Ukraine in 2014. Through the Normandy format, as we all know, France and Germany engaged extensively with Ukraine and Russia at political and senior official levels to pursue a peaceful resolution on the basis of the UN Charter. After their endorsement by this Council in 2015, the Minsk agreements initially succeeded in substantially reducing the violence unleashed by Russia, reducing the violence and with an OSCE mission monitoring their implementation on the ground, which means with a mission that was organized by an organization under Chapter 8. The agreements outlined a political solution based on Ukraine's constitutional order. However, after initial progress, Russia began to systematically undermine the process and violate the Minsk agreements. This included administrative measures such as issuing Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens in Donbass, but also military action such as persistent ceasefire violations and the failure to withdraw heavy weapons. With the so-called Duma elections conducted in the occupied territories in 2021, Russia further disregarded Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Nevertheless, France and Germany worked hard and in good faith to continue discussions with both parties on implementing the Minsk agreements before Russia launched its full-scale military invasion in 2022. Russia obstructed the implementation of the Minsk agreements and chose to pursue an agenda of expansionist conquest. Throughout 2021, despite our repeated efforts to advance the process, Russia refused to participate in any high-level Normandy format meetings, turning away from dialogue. I wish to stress the Minsk agreements were a diplomatic initiative designed to prevent further bloodshed and establish a political pathway to peace in Ukraine in full respect of international law and the UN Charter. Mr. President, this war should not have been started in the first place. This war could end tomorrow, and the suffering of millions of innocent civilians would cease immediately if Russia simply were to terminate its military aggression and withdraw all its forces from Ukrainian territory. Germany, and much more Ukraine, is longing for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. With the third sad anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion in sight, I ask all UN member states to unite behind the draft General Assembly resolution on advancing peace in Ukraine. If we want diplomacy to have a meaningful chance, we need to reiterate our unwavering commitment to the UN Charter in its entirety. This matters not only to Ukraine, but will be in the interest of everyone. I thank you.
我感谢德国代表的发言。现在发言名单上没有其他人了。现在休会。 我宣布，安全理事会第9860次会议现在开始。本次会议的临时议程是秘书长关于苏丹和南苏丹的报告。议程通过。安全理事会现在开始审议议程项目2。安理会成员面前有 S/2025/93号文件，即美国提出的决议草案案文。安理会现在准备对面前的决议草案进行表决。我现在将这项决议草案付诸表决。赞成 S-2025-93号文件所载决议草案的，请举手。请放下。反对的请举手。弃权的请举手。表决结果如下：13票赞成，0票反对，2票弃权。决议草案获得通过，成为第2772（2025号）决议。我现在请想在表决后发言的安理会成员发言。我现在请美国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States welcomes the adoption of the resolution and the renewal of the mandate of the Sudan Panel of Experts. We are confident the panel's independent reporting will facilitate UN member state support for Sudan and efforts to reach a lasting resolution to a conflict that has caused the world's largest humanitarian crisis. The panel's reporting provides unique information crucial to stemming the flow of arms and funds, stopping the fighting, and supporting a civilian-led political alternative to the Sudanese armed forces or the rapid support forces. U.S. support remains steadfast for the Sudanese people and their demands for a durable end to the conflict and a political transition to democratic governance. Thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢美国代表的发言，下面我请圭亚那代表发言。
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3+, namely Algeria, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and my country, Guyana. The A3+ acknowledges the efforts of the United States as the penholder in facilitating the negotiating process. We negotiated in good faith by laying bare our concerns and constructively engaging with all Council members throughout the negotiations. While we recognize the collective effort to agree on a concise version of the resolution, we regret that the A3+ proposal to align the extension of the panel of experts' mandate with the sanctions measures imposed on Darfur, Sudan, was not considered. This misalignment, unique to the sanctions regime in Darfur, must be addressed by the Council. Nevertheless, the A3+ voted in favor of this resolution to reaffirm our continued support for the panel of experts on Sudan, established under Security Council Resolution 1591. We acknowledge its critical role in monitoring developments on the ground and providing comprehensive assessments to the Council. We remain gravely concerned about the deteriorating situation in Sudan, particularly the escalating violence against civilians, the increasing flow of weapons, foreign interference in the conflict, and the recruitment of children continue to exacerbate the crisis. These developments reinforce the need for sustained monitoring and reporting by the panel of experts to keep the Council informed and engaged. In this regard, the A3+ underscores the following. First, The A3+ reiterates, as highlighted by many Council members, that aligning the cycle for both the mandate of the panel of experts and the 1591 sanctions regime is a matter that must be addressed. This inconsistency has persisted for too long and should be corrected to ensure coordinated action and facilitate smoother transitions in future engagements on this file. We anticipate a thorough discussion on this matter when the renewal of the sanctions regime is reviewed in September. Second, as a matter of principle, the A3+ notes that sanctions form part of the toolkit of the Security Council to address conflict situations. However, sanctions are not necessarily the sole strategic means for achieving peace and security in conflict settings. Conflict resolution requires a range of tools, and sanction measures alone have not been universally effective in restoring international peace and security. There must be a clear and defined pathway for the eventual lifting of sanctions with periodic evaluations to ensure they serve their intended purpose without causing unintended consequences. We stress the importance of a principled approach that supports a resolution to the crisis while ensuring that measures imposed by the Council remain balanced and constructive. Third, A3+ calls upon foreign actors supplying arms to the conflict parties to desist and rather use their influence on the parties to agree to a ceasefire and pursue the path of political dialogue to resolve the conflict in Sudan. To conclude, the A3+ remains committed to engaging constructively with all members of the Security Council in the collective pursuit of peace, stability, and accountability in Sudan. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢圭亚那代表的发言，下面我请英国代表发言。
Thank you, President. We voted in favour of this resolution, renewing the 1591 panel of experts, and we thank the US for leading the negotiations. I'll make 2 points. First, I want to highlight the catastrophic situation currently faced by thousands of displaced people at Zamzam camp in Darfur. We've seen reports that the Rapid Support Forces have launched a further assault, contrary to this Council's demands in Resolution 2736. There are harrowing accounts of shelling and targeting of civilians. It's reported that at least 40 civilians have been killed and shelters have been razed to the ground. These are people who were already facing devastating levels of humanitarian need, including famine. So we condemn these attacks. We underscore the need for the protection of civilians in line with international law and the commitments made by the warring parties in the 2023 Jeddah Declaration. The situation underscores the continued importance of the panel's reporting to support the Council's work on Sudan. And once again, we call on all member states to refrain from external interference which foments conflict and instability, and instead to support mediation efforts for a durable peace. Second, we note that while the UK welcomes the renewal of the panel's mandate for a further 12 months, we would have preferred to maintain previous language which, among other things, called for the parties to the conflict to cease violations of international humanitarian law and abuses and violations of international human rights law, and strongly condemned attacks against civilians, including sexual and gender-based violence. President, it is vital that this Council remain focused on protecting civilians in Sudan, given the violence being committed against so many. The UK will continue to press for a much more urgent and more effective international response to the crisis, including a reinvigorated mediation process. I thank you.
我感谢英国代表的发言，下面我请巴基斯坦代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Pakistan voted in favor of the resolution. We believe that the panel of experts is carrying out important work in the fulfillment of its mandate on reporting on the ongoing conflict, including its various dynamics and regional impact, the financing and recruitment patterns, the humanitarian impact and violations of international humanitarian law, and the proliferation of weapons and violations of the arms embargo. However, we regret that, yet again, another opportunity was missed to align the reporting period of the panel of experts with that of the sanctions regime in Darfur. Mr. President, all sanctions regimes must be periodically reviewed to assess their effectiveness and determine their continued utility. The task of the panel of experts is to monitor the implementation of sanctions regime. By extending the reporting period of the panel beyond that of the sanctions regime, the resolution prejudges the extension of the latter. Other sanctions regime of the Council do not have such an anomaly. It was thus only reasonable to rectify it. We regret the inflexibility to accommodate a 6-month extension of the panel with an automatic extension of 12 months conditioned upon extension of the sanctions regime in September 2025. Such an arrangement would have taken into account the concerns expressed during the informal consultations on the draft. Lastly, we find it regrettable that the resolution was put into blue without accommodating the views of all member states. I thank you, Mr. President.
感谢巴基斯坦代表的发言。下面我请俄罗斯代表发言。
Господин председатель, Россия воздержалась при голосовании по подготовленному Соединенными Штатами проекту резолюции о продлении мандата группы экспертов Санкционного комитета 1591 по Суданскому Дарфуру. Мы не единственные, у кого были замечания в отношении проделанной группы экспертов работы за истекший отчетно-мандатный цикл. Рассчитываем, что группа обновления состава которой произойдет в ближайшее время, при подготовке материалов вернется к присущим ей высоким стандартам качества, будет придерживаться критериев объективности, достоверности и проверяемости предоставляемой информации. Принципиально, чтобы в своей деятельности она следовала в русле отведенного ей мандата, сохраняла непредвзятость, а не использовалась в качестве тарана против интересов суданского народа и его правительства. В этом же русле считаем неприемлемыми даже любые намеки на расширение санкционного режима за пределы Дарфура. За 2 десятилетия с момента введения этих ограничений они не принесли суданцам ничего полезного. По резолюции наша позиция остается неизменной с прошлого года. Отрадно, что авторы частично пошли навстречу пожеланиям ряда делегаций, согласились подчистить язык резолюции, не относящийся напрямую к деятельности группы экспертов. В то же время считаем, что наши американские коллеги не до конца использовали диалоговые возможности с суданцами и могли бы быть более восприимчивыми к мнению Афро-тройки. Отказываясь от такого подхода, мы лишь поощряем нездоровые намерения отдельных членов Совета сохранять давление на правительство Судана через задействование санкционных инструментов Совета Безопасности. Наконец, как и в прошлом году, считаем неуместным продлевать мандат группы экспертов и поручать им готовить доклады за пределами временных рамок действия самого санкционного режима, который истекает в сентябре этого года. Благодарю вас.
我感谢俄罗斯代表的发言。我现在以中国代表的身份发言。各位同事，中方对刚才表决的决议草案投了弃权票，我愿阐述中方的有关立场。专家小组是安理会授权成立的制裁机制的组成部分，其任务是协助监测制裁措施的落实情况，并就制裁工作向安理会提出建议。有什么样的制裁措施，就要求什么样的专家小组。因此，专家小组的授权同制裁措施保持时间上的一致性，既是合乎逻辑的安排，也是安理会现有14个制裁机制的普遍做法。这方面唯一的例外，就是本次表决涉及的对苏丹、达尔富尔的制裁机制。当前对达尔富尔的制裁措施将于今年9月到期。今天的决议 将专家小组授权延长到9月之后，直到明年3月，这显然是违反常理的。这首先有预断制裁措施在今年9月必然延期之嫌。另一方面，假使安理会届时调整制裁措施，对专家小组的组成及其专业背景提出新的要求，这又可能使目前的专家小组在履行新授权时面临挑战。两项授权期限不一致问题已存在较长时间，中国和许多成员一直要求加以解决。办法也很简单，只要有一次对专家小组授权延期6个月，就可一劳永逸地实现两者的一致。如果有关国家声称专家小组授权延期不能短于1年，也只需要有一次对制裁措施延期6个月，同样能解决这个问题。这个独一无二的反常现象得不到解决，不是因为问题太复杂，从根本上讲是缺乏政治意愿。执笔国不愿做出努力，寻求最广泛的共识，也不愿从技术角度改进安理会工作的机制和方法。安理会下阶段处理涉苏丹制裁问题，必须解决这个例外。我们敦促执笔国为此负起责任。各位同事，苏丹冲突已延宕近2年，造成严重人道主义后果。中方注意到日前非盟峰会就苏丹问题进行了讨论，我们呼吁冲突各方尽快停火止战，支持联合国同非盟、伊加特等形成斡旋合力，推动各方重回政治对话轨道，呼吁国际社会加大援助力度，帮助苏丹早日恢复和平。我现在继续行使安理会主权的职能。发言名单上没有其他人，现在休会。